Good evening. Thank you for that generous introduction. I want to thank both the student body and everyone in the Divinity School community for making space for my thoughts and words. I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then hopefully we can pivot into some discussion. And I'll just say, as a very brief word, I contemplated a lot in the years I was here between 1990 and 1994. I didn't contemplate this. It is an absolute joy. And relatedly, I hope you don't mind if I share a bit of personal biography related to Yale. Now, I graduated from the college in 1994, 26 years ago, and I have a lot of the kind of standard nostalgia and even the kind of unbecoming clannishness that alums tend to display. But that's actually not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about my family further back. My mother arrived in New Haven 20-odd years before me in the late 1960s, one of 4 black women graduate students to study theology. She chose Yale over the Louvain in Belgium, finding the latter a bit too daunting for a young woman from Birmingham, Alabama. But in truth, she found this institution as alien as if she had traveled to another country. Neither she nor the other 3 black women graduate students remained at Yale, though they all earned doctorates elsewhere. My adoptive father arrived in New Haven around the same time. He was a Jewish man from Brooklyn, first-generation college-educated and training to become a biostatistician. It's not surprising that they didn't meet then. Both were outsiders in distinct fashion at Yale who found their sense of place differently. My mother traveled by bus to Boston, Roxbury specifically, to both socialize and organize politically. My dad argued politics, going further and further left the longer he stayed here. While here, in the wake of the Panther trials and the anti-war movement, he was deeply politicized and took his doctorate to Birmingham, Alabama, to work at Miles College, the historically black college in our town, where he met my mother and decided he would become my parent as well. He died some years ago, but that politicization that first began here and went into full bloom in the South remained until his dying day. Now, unlike other children of alums perhaps, I did not grow up with any stories of Yale at all, but I did grow up with stories. And I decided to sort of orient my talk today in this way because recently at a lecture I was giving about Breathe, it was more of a dialogue, and I talked about in the midst of it, what it means, what the book means to me in terms of sharing what those of us in Black Studies called the tradition. Someone in the audience asked me, were you consciously raised in the tradition? And as much as I talk and think about it, I actually hadn't contemplated that question. And so my first response was, well, I still have my father's copy of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, though it mostly sits in very fine crumbled pieces on the altar in my bedroom. I also have his copy of Charles Chestnut's Marrow of Tradition, which recounts the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina race massacre. And then I described a poem that my mother wrote in the late 1960s. And in the poem, it's one of the ones I don't know, but by heart, but in the poem she described riding the bus. My mother used to cut a very striking figure in the late 60s and early 70s. She would wear her head wrapped in a West African gele and large earrings, usually gold or liquid silver, and beautiful robes. And in the poem, she's sitting on a bus next to an elderly black woman who is nodding off to sleep, who's wearing a wig that is slightly askew. And she ends the poem saying, here she is in her traditional garb and sitting next to her tradition. And I told the story and I was like, well, yes, I was raised deliberately in the tradition. And yet, I still puzzled over the fact that here I had these two parents who had attended this school, but I had for so long no stories of this place. So when I arrived at Yale downtown as a freshman, and we were walking to the freshman orientation on Beinecke Plaza, walking toward in that direction, we walked past this building, and my dad announced as we passed, "Oh, that's where I lived." And then my mother said, well, I lived in Helen Hadley Hall, and it was completely disorienting for me in the way that things are for self-involved teenagers. To think of my parents, organizers, leftists, living here, although I guess technically I knew they had at a certain point. So I made an observation that was kind of cool, and then we moved on. And then I built my life as a student, as we all do. And then when I was a sophomore, going through the course catalog, because, those things weren't online at the time, the Blue Book, I saw a class that captivated my interest, African American religion, and it was taught up here. And I had only otherwise come up to the divinity school to sled. So, so we would steal dining hall trays and bundle up, and then, use them to sled down your hill here. Sometimes going so fast that you had like the wondrous event of flipping upside down. But this time I want to take a course. I was not interested in giving myself a concussion. Although it's fascinating now, because now if you have children, like concussions are like a real thing, and I think, God, we hit our head all the time in the 70s and 80s. Anyway. Now, I was undaunted by the fact that it was a graduate course, hence earning the designation sophomore, wise fool. And I just asked to be admitted to the class, and I was. And when I went home, I told my mother about it, and I told her about my professor, M. Sean Copeland. And then she told me a story about M. Sean Copeland and about the first Black Sisters Conference. A little bit more context first. So the most sort of prominently well-known Black Muslim family in Boston are the Abdul Hallaqs, who are the owners of Nubian Notion. It's this kind of magnificent community-based shop for Black art, jewelry, stationery, artifacts, etc. The matriarch of the family was a cradle Catholic, and her sister, who was from New Orleans, and her sister was in the Sisters of the Holy Family Convent, which my mother had been in as a novice before leaving the order for the movement. And though Mrs. Abdul Hallaq had converted to Islam, she stayed intimate with the church and would sometimes show up at Mass. And she had a son named Sharif, who is a Renaissance man. He's like real estate mogul and photographer, and he's kind of extraordinary man. And he was somehow, probably through his connection to his mother, actually at the first Black Sisters Conference. And so my mother tells me this story about, at a certain point after they have talked about what liberation theology means in the Catholic Church, the sisters lined up, including Professor Copeland, then not Professor Copeland, they lined up, removed their habits, and Sharif cut every single one of them, their straightened hair, bodies of straightened hair, off one at a time. And soon there were dozens of women following vocations with both natural heads and minds, afros. Genealogy is an avocation that creates an archive, and it has its virtues. Storytelling is an art that is much more context dependent. It was only when I was here at this place, for which neither of my parents had any sentimental attachment, that they gave me the stories that allowed me to situate myself here as a person for whom faith and spirit are indistinguishable from values and a notion of the people for whom I work. Since publishing Breathe, several of my friends have described my relation to spirituality as Emersonian. I just kind of snatch up what I need and discard what feels harmful. The act of writing the book was that, in addition to an effort to tell stories that are both context-dependent and in the tradition. To my children, first and foremost, who are the children of the transformative moment of an Obama presidency, and now what is a global practice of watching Black people lynched by police officers and vigilantes who almost always get off scot-free. Of the bellowing of white nationalism and the condemnation of Blackness, of 2 million people in prison. I'll just say as an aside, my father was an epidemiologist and a biostatistician, and in the 80s he was an activist around prison issues in this beginning in the 70s, and in the 80s he was running the numbers, and he says, soon we're going to have 1 million people in prison, and the response he would get is people would say, that's ridiculous. How could any country have 1 million people in prison? Now we have double that. My children are watching their country steal, kidnap, and imprison other people's children at the border. One of the many harrowing cyclical repetitions of our slave past. Vitriol is de rigueur, attention and competition run the world. This is the moment we occupy. So in choosing to write to them and to us in this moment, I have looked backwards to the moments of history and engaged in sort of a mining of the textual reflections of those previous moments for guidance and for models. So my editor first, this book actually wasn't my idea. My editor, I talk about my children all the time on social media. It's really quite obnoxious. But my editor said, oh, what about writing a book to your children? And initially we thought it was going to be humorous because most of the stuff is funny. Like last week, I posted about getting on my older son's skateboard and my younger son saying, you know, get off that, you can bust your head. And then me saying, no, I won't. And then of course I toppled over and I'm very bruised up still. And so it just tends to be stuff like that. And then my older son was like, that conversation was the reverse of what it was supposed to be. And I said, yes, but I clearly haven't extended, it's not even adolescence, like middle school delusion of what I can do. Anyway, so we thought it was going to be mostly funny and like lighthearted. And then when I started to reflect on the moment and what we need, and the stakes of their lives, the stakes of my parenting, the stakes of our world, in this moment, something far more serious emerged. And so part of what I want to talk about is where I went to tell this story textually, what directly inspired this work. So in W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903 classic text, The Souls of Black Folk, he describes people asking him, as a black man, how does it feel to be a problem? In that period, the period that historian Rayford Logan described as the nadir of American race relations, the lowest point, when all of the promises of Reconstruction were betrayed by Southern governments and federal courts, Black people were not daunted, though heartbroken, and acted to organize, to build and nurture children. And one of the things that I think is actually instructive historically is that at that point, every single one of the nation's leading Black intellectuals thought deeply about the lives of Black children, what they ought to be learning, how they ought to be trained to see themselves, what kind of curriculum was appropriate, and belonged to local teachers' organizations as well as the national one. Now, Du Bois is very clear in the text that he's refusing to submit to seeing himself as a problem. He says, I seldom answer a word to the question, and that's a direct lesson I am revisiting for this era. We hear an awful lot about young Black people being problems, even when talking about the bigotry they experience. It's a burden that is so cruel. And I think we have no choice but to refuse it. But I also think we have to look at them in their faces and say, you're not a problem and you don't carry the burdens of the ugliness of the world. Now, later in the book, Du Bois describes the death of his own son, of the passing of the firstborn, as that chapter. And it's a mournful piece, right, in which he describes the devastating grace of a life gone before the full weight of Jim Crow would fall upon the baby's life. And this, reflecting on this piece brought me to my eldest uncle's childhood death, Boot, who died near Christmas from rheumatic fever and apparently an inappropriate dosage of medication. It's an adult dosage. And I wonder, in the text, how my grandmother went on to raise 11 other children and over a dozen of her grandchildren. I thought about the mothers of the movement today, right, whose names we know, whose faces we see after the deaths of Jordan Davis and Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, on and on, about the heroic and mundane task of continuing on, a mother without her dearly loved children. My effort to witness her life, my grandmother, as well as his, as well as those of the mothers, was of course also influenced by James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And of that text, the first is a letter to his nephew, also named James. Right? And James tells James that he has a responsibility to not be shrunken into the ugliness of an unequal society, but also he has a responsibility to see the lives of the elders, and particularly his father, to attempt to understand him in order to cultivate his sense of the world and to deepen his capacity for love. So I've asked my children and others' children and all of the readers to not merely witness the suffering, not merely the wound, but the incredible grace and dignity that coexist with it. It's a disruption of the orders of admiration in our society, which tend to heap praise on those for whom abundance is so huge that it's shameful. There's also the reverse, in which I try to witness the children on the text as well. I'll talk just about one or two more texts, and then we can have a discussion. Pilot Dead, the heroine in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, is an imperfect heroine. But her heroism is in her capacity to love and teach despite error. That novel is, in a sense, and it makes sense because Morrison was, was one of Baldwin's proteges, is instead of an uncle's letter to a nephew, is an aunt's letter to a nephew, and Pilot is ministering to her nephew throughout the text. And she's a woman who's an outcast. She doesn't have a belly button. She wears this weird earring, like hanging earring on one side. And she is someone described as a person who can fly without ever leaving the ground. Her nephew, Milkman, is taught by her that what he was raised to attempt to be is a patriarch. His accumulation of pleasure, his aspiration to wealth, all of the goals of patriarchy are empty in comparison to understanding one's legacy and the transformational power of love. The novel is a creation story, a question and a quest of becoming fully human that does not promise life everlasting. Sorry, it's a little plus, spoiler, he dies at the end. Or any other comforting thing beyond the fact of love. Now, Morrison wrote this novel in the period where society was beginning to open up for Black folks, when the promise of getting a piece of the pie, a la the Jeffersons, y'all are too young for the Jeffersons, most of you, some of you, was coming true, right? The lesson was, do not forget what we taught you from the past. The wisdom of the wisest of the elders is what Morrison warned us all. And even that is an echo of what I refer to as Black America's most precious song, Lift Every Voice and Sing, where there's the line towards the end, lest our hearts drunk with the wine of the world we get thee, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. It's just a kind of repetition of a theme. Now, here we are, waging battles that we once thought had receded, and new ones come as the earth screams, and precarity grows, and mass killings and mass weapons coincide with a narrowed imagination. There's something about that, too, that I'm trying to talk along with. The sections of the book are an homage to two works, Richard Wright's Native Son and Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and also to Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well. I see the world somewhat differently than all of them, but read them as in the tradition, and my engagement with them is, I think, in part of the long history of that tradition as well. When Toni Morrison asked of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, invisible to whom, right? It was an insistence upon our witnessing each other. The structure of both Native Son and Between the World and Me has three parts: fear, flight, and fate. My parts are fear, fly, and fortune, because I do not think we give up the dream of flight, even in a time where it seems as though freedom is a fugitive concept. I think the tradition is a thing of great fortune that pushes back against what fate appears to be. I issue a challenge that though we cannot offer optimism around the questions of race and many other forms of inequality, we can offer hope as a praxis, if not an article of faith. We can offer history as a guide. At the conclusion of Invisible Man, the protagonist is living in a sewer, a labyrinth-like sewer. He has outfitted it with thousands of lights, a tomb, or perhaps a womb, in which he can be fully illuminated in ways that seem impossible in society. He can actually be himself. And this is somewhat metaphorical. The place where you are seen fully, I think, is usually more social than geographic, but it is an essential endeavor. And so part of, as opposed to the underground bunker of sorts, I argue that we ought to value those relations in which we can fully be ourselves as a means of refusing the imposed norms and ideologies that leave us with an epidemic of loneliness, even in the thrall of constant chatter. The distillations we perform in the information age, right, choosing what to pay attention to, what to hear, what to see, who to talk to, ought to have an ethical underpinning, bringing us closer to ourselves, to what to do to what to attend? To whom do you give your energy? How do you read? What do you read? What do you hold? What do you cherish? Those of us who look to the past, who stand at the crossroads between here and there, between the ancestors and the future, between life and death, must meditate on the good and the calling there at the threshold of worlds. It is there that we can find both our purpose and our necessary humility. Now, that said, the daily heartbreak of a cruel world sometimes makes the effort feel futile. I suppose that is why I often think of our lives in this period as a matter of sacred time. I recently saw a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre in which he said, I don't know about my translation, I'm not a French speaker, although I am studying it on Duolingo. He said, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." And I love this, even though I'm not sure I can imagine Sisyphus happy with that boulder. You imagine the hills over here, rolling it up and down, right? But I love it because it's an invitation to interpret anew, to see Sisyphus finding meaning in the repetition is a more imaginable thing for me. So when Ella Baker intoned, mother of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Civil Rights Movement, said, "The struggle continues, the tribe increases," right? She taught us to see our lives as governed by divine purpose, even if realization of the desire for freedom seems nearly impossible and certainly not feasible in our individual lifetimes. And I think that is both the best and most beautiful thing that we can do. Okay, I'll stop there for questions or comments. Thank you.
Because the people sitting around you will know who you are, but Professor
Perry
won't know who you are. Just be nice and make sure you pose your questions succinctly, as I like to say. Disguise any comment as a question. So the floor is open, and if you'll raise your hand, we'll call on you and bring you a mic.
I used to be a law professor, so I will call on you if you don't ask questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. On page, oh, sorry, I forgot. Dawn Jefferson, second year MDiv.
Yes.
On page 82, you discuss what you are saying is the difference between freedom and leisure. They are not the same thing. And I was hoping you would elaborate more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because we live in a context in which there's two pieces. One is that there's the precarity we live with creates this sort of constant pressure to be laboring, right? Kind of intensity and exhaustion overwhelms us. And then we also live in a kind of attention economy and display culture. And one of the ways I think we tend to resolve the stressors that they both put on us is to simultaneously make proclamations about our leisure time and put them on display, right? And I think it's fair to say that it largely winds up being unfulfilling, right? So I just went to the NAACP Image Awards, and there's a lot of picture taking that, pictures are great, but a lot of it was about, I'm going to show the world that I'm actually not sort of crumbling under the weight of the hamster wheel. And so that's really that's really the core of where that comes from, to not see those kind of fugitive moments of pleasure or display as the same thing as actually experiencing a life where you feel freedom, either in the large sense, right, of liberation from domination, or in the personal sense of the kind of feeling a deep sense of comfort and joy in the life that you're engaged in and in relation to other human beings, in relation to your environment and the land and the like. And so that's like my little kind of curmudgeonly critique of the very things that I participate in, but understand are oftentimes much more, create much more hunger than satisfaction. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mahogany Thomas. I'm a third-year MDiv. Thank you for being here. Part of why I personally love your book is because it's so poetic and beautiful, intimate and courageous, right, in truth-telling. And I'm wondering how or what advice do you give to someone who's looking to hold on to their poetic voice in a world of academia that constantly is looking for you to perform in a certain way?
Right.
That's my question.
It's a great question. I'm afraid my advice is never really good on this question because, let me say it this way. I do think that to be strategic professionally, if you enter academia, you have to learn to speak the language of your field and to enter the conversation, which in some sense constrains language, right? So if you're talking, each field has a bibliography, and we enter into the conversation to make our intervention, but also to become part of a chorus of voices helping to understand an idea or a concept or what have you. But I think even when you're in that period of your professional life, you still look for your voice, right? So to navigate between being legible and also cultivating, both aesthetically, but also in terms of content, right? What your particular contribution to the world of ideas will be. The other thing I say is, and someone asked me a similar question yesterday, and I said, one of the wonderful things about the academic world is that, we're not dancers. This is a long career, right? And so I think it's fine, to also take time, learn the tools of the trade. I always felt like in my early career that it was really important to have another creative outlet in addition to my scholarly writing. At that point, early it was visual arts. It wasn't writing. It was actually did a lot of collage art, not for a public at all, but just for because I had to exercise that piece. So I do think you nurture that part of yourself, but it's also okay to wait 5, 10, 15 years. It's a wonderfully long life being a creative intellectual. And so I'd say don't rush. And it's also good to sort of take time to figure out what you really think, right? Which could take a while. Thank you. Shall I ask a...
Are we ready for a glass of wine? Is that what you're saying?
No? Yes?
Okay.
Oh,
I'll back here.
that's my friend.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Gabrielle. I'm in the American Studies department. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to kind of continue along that line of doing work long term, thinking about creative and intellectual work, not just in the immediate deadlines, but over a longer course and period of time. And so given both your own work, but also conversations that you've had with organizers, artists, cultural workers, what are some of the kind of key threads that you've been thinking through to be able to both sustain and think through long-term creative work?
Yeah. So it's funny. I was part of the conversation that I had yesterday, actually, at Harvard. We were talking about sort of there was a discussion about scholar activism, right, which is not a designation that I claim, because I think, you know, being an activist and an organizer is really in many ways like it's a holistic commitment, and I admire it too much to kind of claim the designation. But I do think that part of the reason I kind of hitched myself onto critical theory in the Frankfurt School and then the Birmingham School of American Studies is because the idea was that the work that you do is guided towards a vision of a society that is healthier and more just than the one we currently occupy. And as much as academics, and actually one of the few areas in which there is not that kind of overwhelming pressure to pretend objectivity is theology, right? So often academics make this pretense towards being objective, like it's whatever the research shows is what we'll say. And of course, anything that you devote a serious amount of your heart and soul and your energy into, you do so because of certain commitments, right? There's always ideological commitments. There's always values in whatever you decide to devote your life to. And so I decided that I would try to be transparent about that, and be thinking at every turn, you know, I'm thinking about patriarchy. I'm thinking about the ravages of capitalism. I'm thinking about the ideology of white supremacy. I'm thinking about decolonizing the world, and really the way the age of empire, not just dominated people and land, but imaginations, and trying to figure out how to think in ways that help emancipate us from that, along with others, right, in community, in ethical community as well as intellectual community with others. And so that's taken different forms for me. So my first book was about hip-hop because I was interested in thinking through the ideas that were emerging in this discourse that was sort of outside of what was considered respectable. My second book was a devotion to figuring out how and why racial inequality persisted in this country, despite the fact that, you know, for the last, 30 years or so, maybe more, 40 years, racism has been considered a bad thing, which was a real transformation in the society, and yet it continues to be extended, and it's not simply a function of institutional or structural problem, but actually the decision-making processes, because we live in a culture that sustains inequality. And then, Vexy thing, which is sort of my big book on gender theory, which is really an effort to think about patriarchy not as an attitude, but in fact as a structure that is created by modernity, that hinges on property, that hinges on the sovereign nation state, that hinges on the idea of legal personhood, who counts and who doesn't, right? Not all people count as legal persons before the law, as demonstrated so dramatically in recent years. So, so for me, it's like the books actually stand each as sort of continuations of a very long thread of interconnected thoughts. And so it used to be that I felt like people are always like, yeah, she's all over the place. But now it's finally coalescing into a kind of a body of work. And I do think, just to go back to the earlier point about writing, that you do work your way, whether it's in writing or whether it's by virtue of homiletics. Sorry, I'm Catholic. Whatever the vehicle is, that one works one's way through a set of ideas over time, right? That it doesn't, and that we ought to feel comfortable with the processes of growth and transformation as we do so. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Jalen Parks, a first-year Master of Divinity student, also Morse College class of 2019.
Hey.
But I had a question regarding, on page 18 in the book, you make mention of our witnessing of private grief and kind of urging us to move away from your language of colonizing it in our heart. And I think that colonizing is a very particular word in a very particular language. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about why that word and why that language.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself worrying, particularly, I mean, I'll say the couple of layers of it. So the first layer was, at a certain point, I said, I'm going to stop watching Black people be murdered, right, on the computer, right, or the television. So stop watching television. And people said, well, no, it's important because, people need to know what's happening. And I was like, well, I don't need video evidence to know what's happening. It's been happening for the entirety of American history. This is not new. But also, it felt incredibly inappropriate to me that corporations, which these news channels are, were making money. I mean, there's advertising that's on the screen as you watch people be killed, right? Making money off this platform. And then in the midst of it, right, the effort to use this as a political argument, which I understood, but often seeped into, well, I am going to express my anguish by saying that could have been my child. And I said, there's something, for me, I thought there's something wrong because it's not my child, right? And it felt as though sort of taking hold, because of my very particular fears as a Black person and as a parented child, taking hold of somebody else's story and making it have meaning because of my own terror as opposed to on its own terms, right? And so I said, we have to, and even, I thought it was really important for us to witness the parents, right? But I, at times, felt as though there was the way they were being engaged was not witnessing, but deploying them for argument. And so for me, it was an important thing to say because, yes, political strategy is always complicated, but these were people whose children, innocent children, had been murdered in the street, right? And at times left on the street. So that's where it's coming from. Thank you for that question.